And I'll introduce myself. My name is David Fass. Most of you have probably heard one or two of these or more of these webinars before, so you know that I'm the trainer at iNetSoft, and I do these training webinars once a month for the past at least a year and a half. We've been doing these. And this is the latest in a series. Lately, we've been focusing on topics related to reporting, whereas the earlier webinars were focused more on dashboards. So now we're getting into report topics. And today's topic is creating a parameterized report, as you can see on the title slide here. At least I hope you can see. If you can't see anything, again, let me know, and I'll see what I can do about it. But as far as I know, I am showing my screen, so you should be able to see. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. Unfortunately, I cannot hear you asking questions. So if you do want to ask a question, type in the chat box or type in the question box, whatever the interface gives you there. And I'll see it pop up on my screen, and that way I can address it. But everybody is currently muted, so I cannot hear you. Okay, let's get started with this topic, creating parameterized reports. And parameterized reports are very common, and the reason for that is that in general, reports have the capability of pulling back tremendous amounts of information, right? You could be talking about millions of rows, tens of millions of rows, and generally you don't want users to be doing that, right? So even though the report, a given report in principle, is capable of pulling back and displaying a tremendous amount of data, generally a user does not need all that data because it's very hard to browse through 100 million rows of data. And also pulling back all that data represents a significant hit on the database, right? If a database gets a query to, send back 100 million rows of data, that's not insignificant from the database standpoint. And of course, your database is trying to serve many users for many different purposes at the same time. So you don't want a given user hitting the database for millions of unnecessary records. So it's very common when you're designing a report to implement parameterization of one type or another to limit, generally, to limit the amount of data that's returned by the database. And that's, probably 95% of the types of parameterization that you would be doing on a report would be with the purpose of limiting the amount of data that's being returned. So that's where we're going to focus, and I'll show you that it's really fairly simple. So let's do the simplest kind of example. So I'm going to go over to, I have Style Studio open over here in the background. All right, so here's Style Studio, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very simple parameterized report. And so I'll create, and I'm not going to really give any attention to making a beautiful report here because that's not the it's not the point of the talk. Point of the talk is to show you how to parameterize a report, whatever your report happens to look like. So here I'm just going to make a simple blank tabular report, the most basic type of report, and I'm going to add into it just a basic table. And so this is the blank report page. I'll press the table component over here to open up the table wizard. And as the data source for this table, I'll just select a simple query from our sample query folder called all sales. And then I'll press finish. Note that there is the option to add a condition at this point, right? So when you go through the table data binding wizard, you can select columns, you can add a condition, and in fact, when you add a condition here, you can parameterize the condition, but I'm not going to do that right now. I just want to start with a very simple table with no parameterization, so I'll press finish. All right, and so here's my basic report. It's got a table in it. Of course, if you want to see what this report will actually look like to the user, you can press the preview button, or you can press the live edit button. I'll just do a preview here. And we get a report that goes on for 17 pages. You can see up here at the top right corner, it says there's 17 pages. You can go through all the pages. And you can easily imagine that had we done this with a larger database, our sample database that we use for these training webinars only has about 4,000 records in it. So it's a tiny, tiny database. But you can imagine that if you created a report like this with no filtering, right, this table, and this table was just pulling back data from all sales across all time, across all regions, This could easily, contain hundreds of thousands of records, millions of records, if you didn't put any filtering on it. So when you're creating a report like this, it's very, very common to implement some kind of filter. Now, the most basic kind of filter that you could apply would be just some kind of static condition, right? And I think we've probably looked at this in earlier trainings, but what you can do is, if you want to restrict the data returned in this table, you right-click on the table, select condition, and that opens the condition dialog box, which is very familiar. We see this condition dialog box in a lot of different contexts, both for reports and for dashboards. And what you could do is you could apply a simple static condition, and that might be something like order date is in range of, let's say, this month or something like that. All right, so this is a simple static condition. Order date is in range this month. Append, press OK, and now this report, this table has a condition on it which will filter and restrict the amount of data. And so if we preview this report, you can see that now it's a one-page report because we've restricted the data to to just this month, right? So that's very, very common, again, because generally you don't want reports without filters on them of some kind, because the report will simply be pulling back too much data, and that's not good for the user and it's not good for the database. So adding these kinds of filters is very common when you're designing reports, and in fact is recommended, that you apply filters that will limit the amount of data. Therefore, the database only has to return a small amount of data, and the user can easily digest that data. Now, the limitation of this approach is that it doesn't give the user any control over what they're seeing, right? We implemented a filter on the table, and when the user views the report, they get what they get, right? And they don't get upset, as I would tell my daughter. The user just gets what they get because this table has a filter on it, happens to be data from this month, and the user of the report didn't have any say in the matter. Right, so this takes us to the main topic of our talk, which is how do you parameterize these kinds of filtering conditions to give the user control over the filter that gets applied. All right, and that's fairly simple. So let's close this preview, and let's just see how we could implement a parameterized condition. Okay, so let's go back into the condition dialog box. So I'm back in the design view here, right-click on the table, select condition. And what I'll do is I'll set up a parameterized condition. Let's do the following thing. Let's, instead of doing an in-range date operation, what we'll do is we'll do a between operation. So we'll do order date is between, right? And then what I'll do is I want the order date to be between a particular start date and end date that the user specifies. All right, so how would I do that? How would I add a parameterized date condition? So what I do is I press this pop-up button over here on the right, and I switch it from value to variable. Right? When I do that, I see a text field over here where I can enter the name of a variable, and so I'm just going to enter the name of a variable called start date. Right? Now that's an arbitrary variable name. I just made that up. Right? That's not a keyword or anything like that. Right? I just decided that I want to have a variable called start date, and that's going to contain ultimately the starting date for which I want to see the data. Right? And the user is going to supply that value at runtime when they execute the report. And I'll do the same thing down here. For the ending date, I'll select variable and just type in again an arbitrary variable name, and I'll just call it end date. So basically what I'm doing here is I want to set up a condition that restricts the data to be only sales between two dates, start date and an end date, that the user will specify at the time that the report is generated. Okay. So I'm going to press modify, and that will change the condition that we had before to now be a condition order date is between a parameterized start date and parameterized end date. Okay, let's add another clause into this condition, another parameterized clause, and this one will be to give the user the ability to select a set of companies. All right, so here what I'll do is I'll select company is one of, and then what I could do if I wanted a static condition, right, I could press this browse button here, and I could select a list of companies that I wanted the table to represent. But again, that would not give the user any choice in the matter, right? So if I want to give the user a choice in the matter, then what I do is I press the pop-up button over here on the right, select variable, right? And then I give the variable a name. In this case, I'll call it comps for companies. And then typically what you would do is you would, in this case, you would select this use selection list item. Right? Use selection list means that when the user is prompted to supply the names of companies, they're going to see a selection list and they can choose the names of companies from the selection list. Just for the moment, though, I'm going to leave that unchecked because I want to show you what happens if you don't supply the value of a parameter. Right? So I'll leave that unchecked for the moment, and I'll just press over here, Insert. And so now what we have is a two-part condition, and both parts of the condition are parameterized. Of course, that doesn't have to be the case. You could have a condition where one clause is parameterized and another clause is static. That's not a problem. But here we've got a fully parameterized condition. Company is one of a set of companies that the user will select at runtime, and order date is between a start date and an end date that the user will supply at runtime. Right? So that's an example of a parameterized condition. So once you've set that up, you press OK. And then if we preview this report, press the preview button, you can see that now the user will be prompted for those parameters. Right? So the first parameter, comps, is a list of companies. Now, you can obviously see the benefit of having a selection list, because how would the user know what companies they're allowed to type in there? They wouldn't. So really, in a practical situation, you would need to give the user a list of companies. I happen to know that there's a company called Big Ed's BBQ, so assuming that I'm spelling this right, something like that, Big Ed's BBQ. So that should be a valid company that I just happen to know because I'm familiar with the data set. And then I can enter a start date and an end date. Right? So I could say, let's say the beginning of the year would be my start date, and let's say I just choose today as the end date. Right, so beginning of the year to today, that's my date range. Press OK. Right, and then I should get a report that is restricted according to the parameters that I specified. So what I'm looking at here is just sales to a company called Big Ed's BBQ. That's one part of the filter. And I'm also looking at just sales from the beginning of the year up until today. Right, so you see 2016, and we've got a few different months there. The earliest sale in March of this year. So that's an example of a parameterized condition. And again, this is a very common way to allow the user to interactively specify the filtering that they want on the report. Now, just one thing to point out before we go further, and that is that the parameter prompt that you see here, right, this one, right, will look a little bit different when the user is viewing the report in the portal. So let me just illustrate that, and most of you are probably familiar with this fact already, but let me go ahead and save this report, and I'll call it, I'll just call it basic parameter prompt. I'll just call it basic parameter. And I'm saving it as a repository report so that I can go right over to my server and check it out over there. So hopefully I've got a server running over here somewhere. All right, so I've got my server up. Let me refresh this repository listing. And there is this report that we just saved as a repository report. Load that up. And so as a user accessing this report in the portal, right, so I'm going to see a prompt that looks like this. Right, it's basically an HTML page. From a functional standpoint, it's the same as what we saw in Style Studio, just not a floating dialog box. And so again, I can enter companies. Big Ed's BBQ is the only name that I actually remember. And then a start date and an end date. I could do the same as before. Again, the interface, the widget here is a little bit different, but functionally the same as what we saw before. Okay, so I've entered the parameters, press OK, and again I should get that very short table as my report. Okay, so now what happens though if I don't enter parameter values, right? So let me reload the report. Right, so here's the parameter prompting again. Now what happens as a user if I neglect to enter parameters or intentionally don't enter parameters? Well, what's going to happen is that basically the conditions that use those parameters are dropped. Right? So when you have parameters that are not specified, the condition, in this case it's the condition on this table over here, if the condition cannot be applied because there's no parameter values, then the condition just doesn't get applied, and what you end up seeing is all of the data. So if I proceed ahead with no parameters here, right, I just get this 17-page report with the long table. Right? And basically what I'm seeing here is all of the data. So that's just something important to keep in mind about parameterized reports, and something also to, it's a contingency to keep in mind. If you're giving the user the option to enter parameters like this, if there is the possibility that the user can neglect to enter parameters, then you should be prepared for the fact that the conditions might be dropped, right? And what are the consequences of that? Well, for the reports that you're creating, if you're creating these reports off a database with millions and millions of records, then the consequence of the user neglecting to enter a parameter could be that they're going to pull back 100 million rows of data. So what would you do about that? Well, you would probably want to handle that with some script in the report, right? So you would want to check the parameter values and see, is there a parameter that was not entered, a null parameter? And if that's the case, then do something, right? So supply a value for that parameter. And we'll see an example in a little bit of how you can set parameters in script, but that would be a typical way to handle that. You just check the parameters in script, and if a parameter value was not supplied, then set that value in script to something reasonable to, again, to prevent the situation of the user pulling back tremendous amounts of data that they don't need and that they don't want. Okay, so let's move on from here. I'm going back to Style Studio now. Okay, and the next thing that I want to show you is that you can also parameterize a report by placing parameters in the query or in the data worksheet that the report uses. So what we've just done in this example is we put the parameters at the report level, right? We put them in the condition that's on the table in the report. And of course you could do this also for other components that are in a report. So for a chart also you could add a condition, and for other report components that display data. So for example, just to illustrate this, let's say that following the report I have a chart, and I'll just make a very simple chart here. So I'll just whatever the data source is, let's say I use the order model for the chart. Of course, in a report, different components can use different data sources. So let's say that I just had something very simple like a salesperson first name on the x-axis and product total on the y-axis of the chart, right? So just a very basic chart. Just like we did for the table, you could apply a filtering condition to the chart, right? You can right-click on the chart, select condition. It's the same dialog box again, and the same procedure to set a condition. You could set a static condition, or you could set a parameterized condition, just like we did for the table, right? So I'm not going to do it again, but just just to point out that you could, if you find here somewhere companies, customer company is one of, right? Again, variable. Provide a name for the variable. If you use the exact same variable name, that means that that one variable is going to be used for both the chart and the table, right? So the user would only be prompted once, right? So if I were to add this condition to the chart, customer company is one of a list of companies supplied by a variable called comps. That's the same variable that I used on the table. That means that the user will only be prompted once for that variable, and the value, the list of companies that they supply, would then be used for both the condition on the chart and the condition on the table. Anyway, so the procedure is exactly the same. You can follow this procedure for any report component that provides that conditions dialog box. Okay, that being said, let me delete the chart. And before we just take a look at parameterizing a query or parameterizing a data worksheet, let me just show you what it would look like if I had set the selection list on this table. So if I go back to the condition over here, this is again back on the table here. If I select that clause of the condition where the company filter is implemented and just select use selection list, that option that I intentionally neglected earlier, right? Select that guy, press modify, right? You don't see anything visible change over here, but now it's going to use the selection list. Press OK, save the report, right? And if I preview the report now, then what you'll see is that instead of getting a blank field where the user has to, try to figure out what company to enter. Now they get a nice list of available companies, and they can, control click to select the list of companies that they want. So obviously that's much more usable approach. Okay, now back to the topic that I just mentioned, which is that you don't have to parameterize a report at the level of the report. You can also parameterize a report at the level of the query or at the level of a data worksheet. So let me just illustrate that. Let's say that I wanted to parameterize the query. Now this report is based on a query called all sales. So let's say that I'm going to make a different report, and because I just want to illustrate this other approach. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually open the query definition and put the parameterization at the query level. Right? So this is just a report. Let me find that query. So I'm going to press the asset link over here on the left to open up my asset panel. And I'm going to find that particular query. It should be under data source, under orders, under sample queries. Right? So there it is, the all sales query. Right, if I double click on that, it will open the query for editing in Style Studio. And we haven't spent a lot of time in these webinars talking about editing queries, at least I don't recall having done that. So I'm not, in case any of this looks unfamiliar to you, I would say just don't worry about it for the moment. But this is the definition of a query. It's a graphical representation essentially of this SQL string. I just pressed the SQL string tab. This is the instruction that gets sent to the database to return the data. And what I want to point out here is that you can actually apply conditions also at the query level. Right? So what I could do is in the query definition, let's say that I wanted a particular date range. So I could do something like this. I could say order date is between, let's see if there's a between operator. Yeah, is between, and again, just like we did when we were parameterizing the report table, could do the same thing here. Start date and end date. You'll notice the visuals here are a little bit different. There's a $ in parentheses, but conceptually it's the same. I'm just setting up variable names here, start date and end date, and then append the condition. Right. So this condition that I just appended is going to be part now of the query definition. And the query, whenever this query gets sent to the database, it's going to be parameterized and filtered so that the only records that are returned are records that have an order date between the start date and end date, whatever those happen to be, right? And that means that the user or somebody, either script or some other source, is going to have to specify the start date and end date at the time that the query is executed. So let me save this query with that parameterized condition and just show you how this would work. Right? So now I'm going to go back to this blank report. And in this blank report, I'm going to create a table that uses that query, that parameterized query. So in fact, the very same table that we did before for the previous report. I'll just find that all sales query. There it is, which now has a parameterized condition on it. Right? And press finish. Right, so here's a new report with a table. This table is pulling data from that all sales query, which now has a parameterized condition. And I just want to illustrate to you that if you execute this report, the parameters in the condition will be prompted to the user. Right? So if I were to preview this report, you can see that start date and end date, those two parameters are being pushed through to the user, and the user can supply values for those two parameters. Right? And again, hopefully this is obvious to you, but the parameterization in this case is not at the report level, right? We didn't put a parameterized condition on the table in the report. Rather, the parameterized condition is on the underlying query, right? And so whenever an underlying query has a parameterized filtering condition, it will attempt to get the values of those parameters from the user, right? Or we could set those parameters using other methods as well, which I'll mention shortly. But if you don't take any other action, then those parameters will be prompted to the user, as you're seeing here. Now you may wonder, if these are date parameters, why does it have a text field here, right? What's the user supposed to enter into this text field? So probably what we would want to do is we would want to explicitly set the type of the parameter to a type date. So let me just show you how you could do that. Cancel this. And what I would do is I would go up to the report menu up at the top, select the parameter option, and we'll come back to here in just a moment. right? But this is kind of your central headquarters for parameters in a report. And you can see that it does list the query parameters, start date and end date. It lists them in the report, even though the parameters themselves actually exist in the underlying query. Still, the report is aware of them, and so it lists them here. And what we could do is we could set the data type, right? So I could select start date and set data type to type date, and same thing for end date, type date. Right, so I'm just explicitly setting the types of those variables, and that will control the way that the user is prompted for those variables. There's a bunch of other settings here, and we'll come back and look at a couple of them in just a moment, but press OK. And then if I preview this report again, right, the parameters are now prompted as date parameters, right? So just like we saw before, you get this little calendar widget, you can select a start date and an end date, and the values that you enter. So again, let me just select the beginning of the year and today's date. Okay. So you enter these parameters, and then what happens is that the parameter values you enter here get passed through to the underlying query, and the query executes, and the data comes back to populate the table in the report, and you get the report that here it's a 4-page report that has the data that corresponds to the range of dates that we just specified. So from the beginning of the year to today's date, right? So that's the data that we're looking at here. Right? So that's just all to illustrate the fact that when you're thinking of parameterizing a report, you're not restricted to putting the parameters at the report level. You can also put the parameters at the query level if your report is using a query, and I'll show you in just a second that you can also put them in the data worksheet, at the data worksheet level if the report is using a data worksheet. So let me just illustrate that really quick. First, the first thing I want to do is close this report and then set the query back to the way it was. So I'm going to get rid of the parameter on the query because I don't want that to mess us up later. So I'll delete that parameter, save the query back as it was originally with no parameters, with no conditions. And I just want to illustrate that if you create a report based on a worksheet, so let's create or let's modify a worksheet to have a parameter. So I'm opening up the asset panel again, and I'm going to look for a worksheet that I can quickly modify here. Let's say in the sales folder here, there's one called Sales Explore. So I'll open up that worksheet. So here's a worksheet. I think we've done webinars on worksheets before, so hopefully this isn't too foreign to anyone. So here's a worksheet, and you can put a parameter on a worksheet. To do that on a worksheet, there's this button over here called the Condition button. So you press that, and we see our familiar conditions dialog box. The interface is a little bit different here, but I'll just add a condition to this worksheet that just makes something very simple, like company is one of comps, some list of companies that's going to be supplied by a parameter. Right? Same kind of condition that we used earlier, except that here I'm putting it on the worksheet. Right? And then we're going to use this worksheet for a report, and again we'll see, hopefully not too surprising, that this parameter again will be prompted to the user so that the user will supply the value. So here we're just setting up a parameterized condition on the worksheet, press OK. The worksheet will prompt us now also for that parameter, but I'm just going to ignore that and save the worksheet. And then if we were to go ahead and create a report based on this data worksheet, so again I'll do a new report. This time let me I'll just drop a chart into the report. And this chart I'm going to base on that Explore data worksheet. So let's see if I can find that. There it is, Sales Explore. Right, so I'll just do something, let's see, what should I do here? I'll do category on the X. Let's do very simple, category and total. All right, so I've got a chart that's based on that data worksheet, but now we know that we placed a parameter on that data worksheet. So what I expect is that when I generate this report, that I will be prompted for that parameter because the underlying worksheet cannot really execute without getting the value of that parameter because the data block in the worksheet is being filtered based on that parameter. So if I preview this report that I just created with the chart that's based on the worksheet, right, you can see that it's going to prompt me for that parameter. Okay, now this parameter should actually be a list. Now why is it not prompting as a list? It's a good question. I wonder if I can adjust that in the worksheet or if that's something I need to adjust in the report itself. I didn't want to get too deeply into this, so I might just gloss over that one aspect. This is a one-of operator, so I would have expected to get prompted with a list actually in the report. But you know what? I'm just going to gloss over that because I don't want to get too distracted given that we don't have that much time. But my main point here was just to show you that you can parameterize a worksheet and you can parameterize a query, and when the worksheet and the query are used by a report, as we illustrated in this report and in the previous report, the parameters that are used in the query or in the worksheet will be prompted to the user. Okay, so now how do you decide whether you want to parameterize at the report level or at the query level or at the data worksheet level? It really depends on what your use case is, right? So if you're going to have let's say a set of reports that are all based off of the same query, right, and you want to essentially parameterize all of those reports the same way, it might be easiest to put the parameterization, the parameterized filter, on the query itself. Same thing with the worksheet. If you're creating a worksheet and you're going to have a bunch of reports, or let's say also a bunch of dashboards that all use that worksheet, right, and you expect to want to implement the same kind of interactive or dynamic filter on all those reports or all those dashboards, rather than individually putting the filtering condition on the elements of the report or on the individual elements of the dashboard, right? It might be far easier to just put that condition once on the underlying query or on the underlying data worksheet, and then you don't have to mess around with the reports or the dashboards because they will inherit that condition from the underlying query or the underlying data worksheet. Right, so that's probably the main consideration that you'd have when you're making that decision. Okay, so putting that aside, now we know that you can put these kinds of parameterized conditions at many levels. Let's take a look back at the report that we created originally. Let me just undo my change to the worksheet just to make sure that I don't mess myself up for later. Okay, so this is the report that we made originally, and what I want to show you is that in the under the report menu at the top, if you go to report and parameter, again you have this central management or headquarters where you can modify various aspects of the parameters that you have in your report. All right, so in our report right now, this is the first report that we did, there's 3 parameters. There's comps, start date, and end date. You may wonder why these are shown in italics. The reason for that is that these parameters were defined in conditions, right? So they're being displayed here, but they were actually defined in the condition that we applied to the table, right? You can also create parameters over here. There's a new button here, and we'll do that shortly. But before we do that, I just want to point out some of the features that are available for parameters in this dialog box. Pardon me. The first thing is the label, right? So let's say that we wanted, when we're prompting the user, we wanted to prompt them with a little bit more informative label. So instead of comps, we could have something like, enter companies. That could be the label. Oops. That could be the label that the user sees next to that prompt for the parameter. And we could also enter a helpful tooltip, like, supply a list of companies. So something like that. And you could do that kind of thing for any of the parameters. So let me just show you what that would look like if I just press OK. And then if I preview the report, right, so here's the label. Right, now it says enter companies instead of saying comps, which is probably going to be confusing to users. It says something nice. And if I hover the mouse over the list box over here, I see the tooltip. It says supply a list of companies. Again, this will look different when the user views the report in the portal, but functionally it's the same. Again, they're going to see the label, and there will be a tooltip when they hover the mouse that gives them information. And you could do that for any of the parameters. Okay, so back over here, let's just see what else there is. So there's also a prompt user option here. This is important because in some cases you'll have parameters that you don't want to prompt the user for. In fact, in this case, we're actually going to make a modification to this report, and in fact we're not going to prompt the user for a start date and end date. Right? So if I don't want to prompt the user for parameters, Then what I do is I select the parameter, turn off prompt user, select the parameter, turn off prompt user. And we'll come back to that in a second and see what we're going to do instead of prompting the user. There's also the data type, right? You can set the data type for a parameter, and you can set a default value, right? So let's say for the comps parameter, the list of companies, if you want there to be a default option that's selected by default, you can turn off the no default, and then choose the company that you want to appear as the default company for that parameter. There's also a set selection list button over here, and this is in the event that you want to either manually enter the list that the user can choose from, or if you want to use some other query to supply that list. All right, so right now, basically the way we've set it up, the user is going to see a list of all of the available companies. Right, it's basically this list over here. This is what they're going to see. That's the list of companies that they'll be able to select from. But let's say that you wanted them not to select from the full list of companies, but you just wanted them to select from a list of, let's say, 3 companies that you supply. Then what you can do is you can press the selection list button over here, and you can either choose from a query that provides that list. The instructions over here say that it basically has to be the first column of the query, or second column of the query. The first column is the value, the second column is the label. Or you can enter a manual list, right? And it's asking me here, do I want to clear the current list? And if I say, probably going to mess myself up here, but if I say yes, then what you can do is you can press the add button here to manually add a list of labels and values that the user will be able to select from. Okay, let me see if I can cancel out of here and not create too much havoc. I think I'm okay. So that's basically the rundown of what you have in this dialog box. There's a sort option over there, and the final option over here, as report customization parameter. Basically what this does is when that's checked, it means that there's a button in the portal, I think it's labeled enter parameters or something like that. When the user views the report in the portal, they can press that button to re-enter or reselect the parameter value. Right? So if for a parameter, if you check that box, it means that that parameter will be one of the parameters that the user can re-enter the value for that parameter by pressing the Enter Parameters button in the toolbar of the report. Okay. Okay, let's come back though to the start date and the end date. Right. So remember, for those, I selected both of those and I turned off prompt user. Now why did I do that? Because I want to show you that you can add another level of sophistication here by choosing to prompt the user in different ways and then setting the underlying parameters in script. Right. So what's my idea here? My idea here is, let's say that I want to, instead of asking the user for a start date and an end date, I want the user to select a period. Right. I want them to select either year or month. Right. And if they select month, then I want them to see the data from this month. And if they select year, then I want them to see the data from this entire year up until today. Right? So that's the choice that I want to give the user. I don't want to give them, ask them for a start date and end date. I want them to select month or year. Right? So, I mean, one thing I could do is I could see whether I could implement such a thing in the condition itself. But that would actually be difficult. You can take my word for it. What's easier to do is just to leave the condition as it was. In other words, a parameterized condition that uses start date and end date, but to prompt the user for a value of period, for which they'll select either month or year, and then translate that user choice into a start date and end date. Right? So in a lot of cases, that's the easiest way to handle that kind of thing. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new parameter for the report. So I'm going to press the new button, and I'm going to call this parameter period. Okay, press OK. Right, so that creates a new parameter. You can see that that one is not in italics, and the reason it's not in italics is because it's not a parameter that was defined in a condition. It was defined instead in this parameter definition dialog box. And for that period condition, I'm going to set the data type to string. And then I'm going to set the selection list, right? I'm going to decide what I want, how I want to prompt the user for that value. All right, so I'm going to press set selection list, press add, and I want to prompt the user to select either year or month. All right. The label here is arbitrary. The label is just what is displayed in the widget, in the choice box. So I could do something like this year or this month, or I could do year today, or whatever I want to enter for the label. But for the value, I'll just leave it as year or month. Okay, the value is what actually gets submitted when the user makes his choice. And then what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to look at that value in script and use the value that the user enters there to set the start date and the end date, which are used in the condition. So hope this makes sense to everyone. It's just we're adding another level to this prompting. In other words, we prompt the user for a period, and then we use the value that the user submits, either year or month, to set the start date and the end date parameters that are used in the condition on the table. Okay, so I'm going to press OK there. I don't think there's anything else that I need to select over here. Of course, I could set a default, so maybe it'll default to this month. If I want a tooltip, make the label look nicer. Tooltip could say something like choose one. Okay, and I do want to prompt the user for this because that's obviously how the user is going to enter that period. Okay, let me just check if there's anything else that we want to add here. Yeah, there's one other thing that I'm going to add here, and that is another parameter, another report level parameter that will allow the user to enter their name. It's kind of a silly thing, but just to illustrate that in addition to doing complex things here, we could also do pretty simple things here. So I'll press the new button again, and this parameter I'll just call name. Press OK. Right, and it's set to prompt the user. And so basically what the user is going to be prompted for at this point is the list of companies, a period, either month or year, and they'll be prompted for their name. Okay, so let's press OK, save the report, and let's take a look at what's going on here. Okay, so I'm going to preview the report. Right, so there's a list of companies. Nothing's really changed there. I can select some companies, no problem. Now I've got this period prompt over here. I can select this month or this year. The problem is that we haven't added any script to handle this yet. Right, so right now, and I can of course enter my name here. So right now, the period value that I select is not being used for anything, and also the name value is not being used for anything. I didn't set anything up to do anything with that. So I'm going to have to take care of that. But even more importantly is the fact that the start date and end date values are not being set anymore. Right? There's nothing here that's setting the start date and end date values. So in fact, we know that in the condition on the table, the start date and end date part of that condition are going to be dropped. Right? So there's not going to be any filtering based on date as things stand now. So press OK, and right, I get the report that's filtered for the company, but not filtered for dates. Right? So you can see there are dates here going back to 2013, 2014, and so on. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to add a little script that will process the period value that we enter and set the start date and the end date. And then for fun, we also need to do something with the employee's name just to show how we could make use of that. So let's first do the start date and end date. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create an onload script. Right, so if I click in an empty region of the report, you can see that down at the bottom, if you have the properties panel open, there's a script tab over here, and there's an onload script, on init script, on print, and on page break. Also, and sometimes easier, if you right-click in an empty region of the report and you select script, right, it opens up this bigger script editor that also has tabs on load, on init, on page break, and on print. Now, typically when you're handling report parameters, which is what we want to do here, right? The user is entering a value for the period parameter, and we want to process that input to appropriately set the start date and end date parameters that are used in the condition. Generally, you want to do that in the onload handler. It's not the only place that you could do that, but that's the common place. You can't do that in the onInit handler, all right, in the onInit tab, because the onInit script executes before the user is prompted for any parameters, right? So at the time that this script, the onInit script executes, there's no way to get the parameters that the user entered, in this case the parameter value of the period parameter, because the user hasn't entered it yet. All right, so basically the execution order is that the onInit script runs first, then the user gets prompted for parameters, then the onload script executes. All right, so if you want to be able to access the values that the user supplied for parameters, you have to do that either in the onload script, or you can do it in element scripts that you attach to particular elements of the report. But in this case, we'll do it in the onload script. And so what I want to do here is very simple. I'm just going to say if parameter dot, the name of the parameter is period, right? Parameter dot period. You can also, there's various ways to do this. I'm using the autocomplete feature, but also if you scroll over here, right, there's a parameter option here, and you can see the various parameters that are known to the report, and there's parameter period, right? So parameter dot period is the value that the user entered for period, which we know can only be either year or month. So I'll say if it's equal to year, if the user entered year for that particular parameter, then I want to set the start date parameter dot start date. I want to set that to the beginning of the year. All right, I'm going to do this in kind of a simple but dumb way, just for speed and efficiency here. So I'll just do new date, and I'm just going to set this explicitly to 2016, comma 0, comma 1. That means 2016 obviously is this year. 0 is the month. 0 means January. It's indexed. Months are indexed from 0 when you're creating dates. 1 means the first day of the month. So basically, if the user selected as the period, if they selected year, then my start date is going to be January 1st, 2016. Now, why is this dumb? Because this is only going to work, if we run this during 2016, right? If somebody were to run this port next year, then this script is going to be broken because it's hard-coded to 2016. So obviously, if you were doing this right and you wanted this report to be usable, no matter what the year was, then you would do this a different way. It's easy to do, but I just don't want to overcomplicate this right now. So hopefully at least everybody can easily understand what I'm doing here. If the user selects year, the start date is the first day of the year, and then I'll say else. Right? If the user selected something other than year, the only other thing they could select would be month in this case. So then if they selected month, then parameter.startDate I'm going to set to the first day of the month. And again, I'm going to do this in a fairly simple way. Date 2016, and I'm going to set it to the first day of this month. We're in August, so that's index 7. Right, again, indexed from 0, and start date the first day of the month. Okay, and again, this is a stupid way to do it because this only works for this month, right? If somebody runs this report next month, then this is not going to work. So again, you'd want to do this a little bit more intelligently, and you would want to, what you would want to do is you would want to use there's a function called year and a function called month that will pick off, so it would look something like this. I think it would look something like this, like year, and then you could do calc.today. Right, so something along these lines. I believe there's a function called year, and you give it today's date, and it picks off the year. I think there's also a function called month. All right, so you can see the autocomplete month. You give it a date, and it picks off the month. So that would be the better way to do it. But just to keep the script, very, very simple, I'll just do it like this. So hopefully everybody understands what I'm doing here. And basically, I'm just setting the start date depending on whether the user selected year or month, either to the first day of the year or the first day of the month. And then I have to set the end date. And regardless of what the user selects, I want the end date to be today. So I'll do parameter.endDate is equal to calc.today. Calc.today is just a function that gives today's date. Okay, so here basically what I'm doing is I'm handling that parameter input that the user supplies for the period parameter, and I'm setting the start date and end date parameters based on that. And of course, the start date and end date parameters are what are used in the condition on the table. Okay, so that's an illustration of how you can use a script to intercept a parameter that the user has entered, and either modify it or modify other parameters based on that. And this is also the same approach that you would take when you're doing parameter validation, right? So like I mentioned earlier, if you want to detect whether the user has submitted empty parameters or invalid parameter values, you would do that in a script like this as well. You would check the, if there's a parameter called period, you could check what the value is, just like we're doing here. And if it's either a null value, then you could do something intelligent, set that very same parameter to some intelligent value. Or if the user has entered some ridiculous value, like if they, if you have a start date field, and they entered January of 1862, you might want to use a script to catch that and, set it to something reasonable. Anyway, all the same, you do that all the same way, just like we've done here in the onload handler. Okay, so I'm going to close that. And then before we test this out, I'm just going to go ahead and put a little text element up here at the top. And I want the text element to display the user's name. Again, remember that we added a parameter for that. And I'm also going to have it display the start date and the end date, and that will just provide some useful feedback to the user about the data that they're actually seeing in the table. So I'll just put that in the header up here. I'll just add a text element into the header. And I'm just going to put some dummy text into that text element. Right, so there's a text element in the header. And then I'm going to use a script to set the contents of that text element based on the parameters that exist in the report. So I'm going to add this in an element script. So I'm going to click on the text element, and you can see that there's a script tab that opens down here. It has two options, script and on-click script. The script is a script that basically executes when the element is rendered. On-click is a script that executes when somebody clicks on the element, so that's not what I want in this case. And again here, if you want the full script editor, you can right-click on the component and select script, and that gives you the full script editor. I think I'll just use the editor down here. And what I want this to say is, I'll have it say something like report for, oops, it should be text, sorry. Text equals. Text is the property of the text element that contains the contents, right? So the text property of this text element should be report for, that's just a string, I put that in quotes, and then concatenate that with the name of the user, right? And remember that the user is entering their name as a parameter, so it's parameter.name. Concatenate that with, so this will say something like report for Dave, and then it will say for, and then I want to enter the range of dates. So something like start date, oops, sorry, parameter.startDate. I know I'm probably leaving out some spaces or something here, so I'll have to come back and correct this to parameter.endDate. Now let's see, I always leave out some plus symbols when I do these concatenations, but it looks like I've got them all. Now so basically this should read something like, right, so I've got three parameters here, parameter.name, parameter.startDate, parameter.endDate. By the time that this script executes on the text element, those should all have been supplied already, right? The parameter.name parameter is supplied when the user types in their name and presses OK. Parameter.startDate and parameter.endDate are being set in the onload script, which will already have run by the time we get to this script. So that should all be fine. The only problem that I see is that the parameter.startDate and parameter.endDate are date objects, so they're going to be, if we try to display them as strings, they're going to be quite long because they also have the the time and the what do you call it, the zone, Eastern time or whatever. So so what I want to do is a little bit of formatting here. So I'll just use a there's a, hold on a second, sorry, my phone is sounding an alarm for some reason. How do I shut it off? Okay. Okay, 1 second. Pardon me. It's a Amber Alert or something, just deafening on my phone. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so I was just saying that there's a format date function, right? And so what we could do is type format date, and we just take the, whatever date we happen to have. In this case, it's the parameter.startDate date, and I'll just set a format for that, something like the month, and then day, and then the year. And I'm going to set the same thing for the end date, which has disappeared off the side over here. Format date. Okay, so if there's any questions on the script, please feel free to type them in the chat box. But basically, again, I'm just saying that I want the text of this text element to say something like report for Dave for, January 1st, 2016 to August 28th or 26th, 2016. Okay, so I'm going to press the apply button here. And let's test out the report, see what's going on here now. So I'm going to save that report, preview it. Okay, so here's the same prompting that we had before. I'll select a few companies. I'll select, let's try this year, and I'm going to enter my name in the name field. Press OK. All right, and so what I should see up top is I selected year, so I should see January 1st, 2016 to August 26th, 2016. Right, so there's the start date and the end date being formatted as I specified. There's my name, right, which was entered into a parameter .name field, and the filtering on the table should be applied effectively, right? So I should be seeing data in here because I selected year that goes back to basically January. Here's I see a record for January 2016 up through today's date in August for the companies that I selected. Right? Just for a sanity check, let's just try the other approach where I select month. So again, I'll preview this. I'll select some companies. This time I'll select this month and again enter my name, press OK. All right, now it says report for Dave from August 1st, the first day of this month, through August 26th, and you can see that there's only two sales in that period. All right, so this is just an example of kind of using another layer of parameter prompting the user for one parameter, and then using the value that the user supplies for that parameter to set other parameters for which the user is not prompted. Again, right, the user is not explicitly prompted for start date and end date, but ultimately those we're setting those parameters in script, and those are the parameters that are being used to filter the table. Okay, if there's any questions up to this point, wow, it's almost 12 o'clock. Okay, let me see if I could show you just one thing, since we're almost out of time. One thing a little bit additional here. And that is parameter sheets. So for those of you who have to cut out at at 12 o'clock sharp, hopefully this will all be on the video. So I apologize for going a bit long, but I did just want to show you that how you can customize the parameter prompting. So again, up until now, the parameter prompting that we've been doing has all been using this default parameter prompting, right? We didn't explicitly design this parameter prompt, but it just happens to be that because we have certain parameters in the report, this is the parameter prompt that we get, and it's the same thing in the portal. Even though it doesn't look like this in the portal, if you if you go ahead and open that report, right, so you get this parameter prompting screen. Again, we didn't design it, and it might turn out that we're not all that happy with it because maybe we want the parameters in a different something missing there. It's interesting. This was saved. Where was the name? I don't see the prompt for name. That's interesting. Let's see, companies and period. How can that be? Wait a second. Okay, I'm not going to get too hung up on it, but it's a really strange name. It's definitely being prompted. That is the name of the report, right? Basic parameter. Okay, well that's something I will have to look into. Doesn't appear there. It's very strange. Okay, I don't have an explanation for that. I'll have to look into that. But anyway, yeah, certainly in this case, we wouldn't be happy with this parameter prompt because it's missing a parameter. So, and also in some cases you want to be able to stage the parameters. In other words, you want to force the user first to select one parameter and then to make a selection from a second parameter. And whatever the case is, whether you want to control the parameter staging or if you want to control the parameter prompt layout, what you can do is you can create a custom parameter sheet. You can do that, back to Style Studio here, you can create a parameter sheet either as a reusable component, that is a component that can be used for many different reports, or you can create it as a component that belongs to just this one report. So if you want to do it that second way, what you would do is you see that there's a, if you expand the report node at the top of the data source panel, there's a parameter, actually that's not what I wanted to do. If you go to the asset panel, right? Yeah, if you go to open the asset panel while the report is open and you expand the report node there, you can see that there's a local parameter sheet option, right? And if you right click on there, you can select new parameter sheet. So you can set up a custom parameter prompting form just for this one report. I'm not going to do that right now, but there is an example in the documentation if you want to see that. What I'm going to do very quickly is just show you how you can set up a custom parameter prompting form as a reusable component. So in this case, what we're going to do is something slightly different than what we have now. And I just want to, I want to create a prompt that prompts for the employee, right? So you can see that we've got a column employee, and that then prompts for the company. So I'm going to modify this report slightly just to modify the condition here to simplify it a little bit. So I'm going to get rid of the date prompting, and I'll prompt for company, and I'll also prompt for employee with a prompt called EMP for employee. Okay, so company and employee are the parameters that I'm using in the condition, and I'll get rid of this text element. And so if I go back over here, all right, so so I don't need to prompt for this period. In fact, I don't need that period parameter. I don't need the name parameter. I don't need the start date and the end date anymore. Right, all I have, the only parameters that I have in this report that I'm using now are comps, the list of companies, and the employee. Okay, so if I check that out, right, so now I'm prompted for companies and employee, so that's fine. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to illustrate how I can create a custom parameter prompting form by using a parameter sheet. All right, so let me save this report, and I'll go ahead and create a new parameter sheet, press the new button, and to do this, select component, and then select parameter sheet. Press OK. Okay, and I'm going to add, so now what I've created here is a new parameter sheet. This is not a report. Right? If you look up at the icons at the top, you can see that the icon for a parameter sheet is different than the icon for a report. And the way that I'll do that, to create this parameter sheet, is first of all I'll add in a section component, because a section component allows me to place other components within it very freely, and that's very useful when you're setting up a parameter sheet. So you don't have to do this, but it's handy to be able to freely position components. So you first add in a section, and then into the section I'm going to drop some components. And I'll just do this quickly again because we're really running over time here. I apologize. So the first thing I'm going to add is a choice box where the user can select, well actually let me add a list box where the user can select the companies. So there's a list box. And I'll add a label, a text label that says companies. Okay, so there's a list box, and I'm going to add a choice box where the user can select an employee. Right, so there's a choice box, basically a menu, and I'll add a label for that, employee. Okay, so we've got, and one of the nice things about setting this up inside a section is that you've got all kinds of nice alignment tools. You can select things and do arrange, align, and align left, align top, center, all those nice nice things that you have when you're putting components inside a section, so that's why I recommend doing that. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to hook up these components so that they supply a list of employees over here for the user to select from, and over here a list of companies. So the way that I'll do that is I'll right-click on this component, select properties, and we want that menu to provide a list of employees. So I'll go to the choice tab over here. It's often handy when you're setting up a parameter sheet, if you know which report the parameter sheet will be used for, you can press the select report button here, and this report is called basic parameter, and then that will list the parameters in the report here. So basically what I'm saying here is I want this choice box to supply the value for the EMP parameter, that's the employee parameter in the report. And I can provide a tooltip if I want. I'll skip that. And I'll supply the value of that list by using a query, right? And in this case, I'll actually use the order model. So select the query option, press edit, and then the list that we want to display to the users I'll find in the order model. Whoops. Right, order model, columns, and just find employee first name, salesperson first name. Okay, so this is this is giving me the list of the values that I want to supply to the user for the user to select from in that choice box. Press OK, and press OK. Right, so that one's done, at least for now. And then over here, I want a list of companies for the user to select from. So right-click, select properties, go to the list tab. Again, here, do the select report option and choose the report, and that will populate this list with a list of the report parameters. And for this list box, I want the values that the user selects here to be passed into the comps parameter in the report that's being used to filter the report. And I'm going to populate this list also by selecting the query option here and by selecting the data model to provide the values of that list, and in this case it's going to be the customer.company, right? That will supply the values and the labels. Okay, so so we're halfway there. I'm just going to move these things up a little bit, and we'll put a submit button. Where's the submit button? A button. There it is. Okay. Okay, so basically, you can see that I'm not taking too many pains to make things look beautiful here, but basically what we have now is that the user can choose an employee. The user will be able to choose from a list of companies, then press submit, and the value of employee and the list of companies should be passed into the corresponding parameters in the report, and the report should be filtered, and that's going to be our custom parameter prompt. So let's see if we can hook this up to the report now, and then we'll see one final twist, and we'll be done. So I'm going to save this parameter sheet, and we'll call it, I'll just call it, well, I already have my param over there, so let's call it the basic param sheet. That's saved as a reusable component, so you can use that for any report that obviously uses the same parameters. So let's go back to our report, and we're going to hook up the parameter sheet to the report. And the way that you do that is you, in the report, you go to the report parameter option, right? So we've been here before, right? So there's our two parameters. And what we're going to do is go to the prompting tab over here and select Use Parameter Sheets. Press Edit, get this big dialog box. I'm not going to go into all the details of this dialog box now, but the basic thing is that you find your parameter sheet over here on the left, basic parameter sheet, that's the one we just created. You drag it in to the canvas over here, and then you drag from the start point onto the parameter sheet and drag from the parameter sheet onto the endpoint. And in the endpoint, what you should see is you should see all of the report parameters that are listed there should be shown in black. That means that those parameters are getting values from the parameter sheet. Now obviously, the case where you wouldn't see that is a case where, by design, the report is not getting parameters from the parameter sheet, because sometimes you might want you might create a report where some of the parameters are being set by script, or or some of the parameters are being set by parameters passed in the URL, or whatever the case is. So it might be the case that some of the parameters here are still listed in red, and that's okay. But if you see parameters listed in red in this endpoint box, and you expect that those parameters should be getting their values from the parameter sheet, then there must be something wrong, and you'll have to go back to the parameter sheet and make sure that the parameters are set up to pass their values into the parameters in the report that they're supposed to control. Okay, anyway, right, so you set up, so basically what we've done is we've hooked up our parameter sheet, and the reason that this is a kind of a complicated construction here is that you can actually have multiple parameter sheets, and you can cascade them so that the flow goes from the start point to parameter sheet 1, and then based on some condition either to parameter sheet 2 or parameter sheet 3, ultimately ending up at the endpoint. So you can do more complex things here than what we're doing, but we're just doing the basic single parameter sheet approach here. So this is done. Press OK, press OK, and then we can test out. We'll save the report and we'll test it out and see if in fact we're going to be prompted by our parameter sheet. So press the preview button in the report. Right, so now you can see that we're being prompted by the parameter sheet. Obviously it looks a little bit different here than it will in the portal, so we'll test it out in the portal also. I can select an employee, like Sue. I can select some companies. Right, and then basically the value that I select for the employee, the values that I select for the companies, should be passed into the report and filter the table. So I'll press submit, the report gets generated, and the table is displayed, filtered using those values. Now, the only further twist that I want to do here really quick is that, and something that you can do when you're setting up your own custom parameter sheets, is that I want the list of companies to be only companies to which the salesperson has sales, right? So when I preview, when I preview the report, right, if I select, let's say, Eric, I want to be sure that the list of companies that's shown here is a list of companies to which Eric actually has sales, because if I don't do that, then what can happen is I might select Eric as the employee, and I might select a company to which Eric has no sales, and then what's going to happen is I'm going to get an empty report, right? There won't be any records, because if Eric doesn't have sales to that company, then there's no records in the table, right? So to prevent that kind of situation, what I can do is I can filter this list based on the employee that the user selects from this top menu. So let's do that last twist on this, and then I'll take any questions, and then we'll be done. So the way to do that is, first of all, to go to this. I'm in the parameter sheet design again. Let me close the preview. First of all, to go to the employee choice box and set that to submit on change, right? Because what I need is, as soon as the user makes a choice there, I need to submit that choice so that I can use that choice that the user submitted in filtering the other parameter here, right? So whatever the user selects as the employee, I want to use that choice to filter the company list, right? So I need that selection to be submitted immediately. So I do submit on change for that choice box. And then in the company list here, I'm going to right-click on that, select, actually probably select condition. Let me just double check. List, yeah. So what I want to do over here, what I want to do over here is apply a condition to this list, the list of companies, and the condition is going to be that the salesperson first name is equal to whatever the user had selected over here, right? And so that's going to be a variable called EMP. Okay. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm putting a condition on the companies list saying that I only want to see companies in this list where the salesperson first name is equal to whatever the user had entered, had supplied for the EMP parameter. Right? EMP parameter is what we call is the parameter that catches that selection of the employee. I'll press append. Right, and so with this parameter, then when the user makes their choice for employee, it should immediately filter the list of companies to show me just companies for which that user has sales. Press OK. Right, and then save the parameter sheet, and we'll test it one more time. In fact, I'll just go and test it in the portal, and we'll see if the portal is actually working. Where's my parameter sheet? I don't see my parameter sheet. I don't see the parameter sheet in the portal. Let's see, why not? You know, I think let me just try restarting this. I should see it right away, but it's not. No, I still see the basic parameter. It's not picking up the parameter sheet is what the problem is here. Let me, well, since we're way over time here, I'll show you in Style Studio, but in the meantime, let me kill the server and restart the server. And while that's starting up, I'll show you in Style Studio. Okay, so back to Style Studio. Let's just verify that this works in Style Studio. So I'm going to preview the report. There's the parameter sheet. I'm going to select a user here like, yes, that did submit right away, didn't it? I was expecting it to wait for the other parameter. You know why? Because I forgot the parameter staging. So there was one more thing that I left out here. So back in the parameter sheet, I'm in the parameter sheet design. I forgot to stage the parameters, right? So I need to specify. I set up the filtering, right? I set up the filtering for the companies, but I forgot to say that the user needs to first enter the value for employee, and then I want the flow to proceed to the companies list. So the way that you do this is you go to Report. This is in the parameter sheet definition. Go to the Report menu, Staged Parameters, right? And this is where you set up the parameter flow. And so I want the flow to proceed from the EMP parameter. So I drag that over here from the top, and then I drag form.comps below that. Right, so this is the flow that I want. EMP, I want the user first to select a value for employee, and then to enter a value for the companies. Right, so that's the flow that I want through these parameters. That's what I neglected to do. Press OK. Save the parameter sheet, and then let me just preview this one more time. Preview the report one more time, and hopefully this time it works. Okay, so there's the parameter sheet. I make a selection of a user, and what I should see here is a list of companies to which that employee has sales, right? And if I were to change that, then the company list should refresh and show me the list of companies to which that user has sales, and so on. Press submit, and then I get the report. Let's see if I can make it work in the portal, or whether the portal is just going to continue giving me problems here. Okay, so at least this time it gave me the parameter sheet, right? So there's my parameter sheet, right? So you can see that we've replaced the default parameter prompting with the parameter sheet. I can select a user, right? I get a list of companies to which that user has sales, and then I can select from that list, and that way I have the confidence that I'm not going to get an empty table, because the companies that I'm selecting from are companies to which that user has sales. Press submit, and I'll get the report. Okay, sorry I went over time. Hopefully you learned something from all that. So I'll stop here and I'll take any questions that anybody has. Type your questions in the in the chat box or in the question box, and I'll see them pop up over here and I'll answer. One other thing that I did while you're typing, if you're typing, one other thing that I did want to point out that I neglected is that you can also pass parameters in a URL. This is the documentation here, and it explains how if you're launching a report from a URL, for example, you have your own web page and you set up a link to a report, you can actually pass report parameters in the URL, right? So it's just, it's kind of a basic syntax where you has the name of the report and then the parameter that you're passing values into and then the parameters that you're passing in and so on. So, if that's something that you're doing, you could look at that. But I didn't want to go into too much detail on that. But I ended up running long anyway. It doesn't look like there's any questions popping up over here, so I'll stay online for another minute, but I know some of you probably have to run, so thanks for joining. Again, sorry for going over time, and hope to see you back next month, and till then, have a nice weekend. And I'll just hang out here for another 30 seconds or so in case anybody's typing a long question. Okay, looks like there's no questions, long or short. So I'll sign off and have a nice weekend, everyone. Thanks.